And so I want to proceed with the next chapter then in Dead Celebrities, Living Icons, on the Beatles. And I've titled the chapter here, The Beatles, Their Muse, a Car Crash, 5 Bullets, and Some Flowers from the Dead. Now with the Beatles what we have is the first non-American great celebrity, mega superstar that we've encountered in the book thus far. And in this case, it's a collective celebrity, a sort of fourfold Orpheus, as the Beatles were called at one point. And so they represent the British response now to the cult of the lone charismatic American celebrity superstar, typified by Elvis Presley and Johnny Cash and individuals like that. And that's a mythic structure that's basic to the American mentality: the lonely, brooding, self-sufficient individual who is a world unto himself and makes his own world. That goes all the way back into the Western, and you can find it all through American literature. The Western, all the way down to the films of Clint Eastwood, who's the lone drifter who always shows up in a town out of nowhere. That's the American myth of the self-sufficient individual. And it simply transfers it from pop culture into the realm of the celebrity, and you get the archetype of the great, charismatic, lone celebrity. But now the British response to this, and the Beatles were inspired largely by Elvis Presley, who was really one of their favorite American icons. At home, growing up in the suburbs of Liverpool, they were tuning in all these American pop songs coming across the wire on the radio, and they listened to these songs, especially Paul McCartney and John Lennon, and it inspired them to create the British tribal response. So they create the first collective celebrity, the first of the great British supergroups, by creating a fourfold ego through the process of eliminating the front man. Now prior to this, as with Buddy Holly and the Crickets, you always had a front man, Jerry and the Pacemakers. You had a guy out front surrounded as a sort of central ego surrounded by his three helping functions in a Jungian sense. And the Beatles were the first to eliminate that with the idea of the creation of four equally famous individuals, or that's what it amounts to eventually. But the idea is not to let any one of the Beatles' own ego dominate the group. So this is a collaborative effort right from the start. And we can see this on the creation of on the picture of their second album cover. The first album came out in March of 1963, and the second, Please Please Me, that's called. The second album comes out later that year, actually on November 22nd, 1963, the same day as Kennedy was assassinated, and it's called With the Beatles. And the cover of that album shows all four of them together, just their heads, with murky shadows fusing their bodies, so you can't make out their separate individual bodies. And basically it highlights that we are dealing with a four-headed Orpheus here, a being, like a mythological being with four faces, like the Hindu god Brahma, the god that rises up out of the lotus and has four faces. So this is a mythological archetype of a multi-egoic creator being. But it's a four-headed Orpheus, and so it's specific to the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, so it's worth inquiring for a moment, stopping to inquire about that myth for a moment. Now the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice is that Orpheus had this woman named Eurydice who was his paramour and lover, and she is bitten by a snake when she is fleeing from a river god that wants to rape her. She's bitten by a snake, and so her shade descends into the underworld, which is a dark place, Hades. And Orpheus was the archetypal musician who sang so beautifully at the gates to the underworld that they let him pass and enter through. And then Hades grants him, he sings so beautifully for Hades that Hades says, yes, you can have Eurydice on one condition, that as you come to the entrance out of the mouth of the cave of the underworld, don't look back. If you do, you'll lose her. Now, of course, any time in mythology we encounter the one forbidden thing, it's the main thing that, of course, the hero does. And so Orpheus does look back at her, and he loses her. And so he comes up out of the cave alone. And this is bad news for him now, because we note that shortly after this, his death, he's torn apart by Maenads who are jealous of him. He becomes homosexual from that point on. He's torn apart by Maenads, and this is basically a myth of what happens with writer's block. Eurydice was his muse, and once she is stuck in the underworld and she can't come up, it means there's a block in the creative flow there. The artist is doomed from that point on, unless a way to unblock the flow can be figured out. But as we track the disintegrated Orpheus and we see his head, it goes down a river that comes out the ocean, and the rest of the body is destroyed, but the head winds up on the island of Lesbos, where it becomes an oracle. And that myth then is almost certainly a myth that captures the fact that it was on the island of Lesbos that traditionally lyrical music was invented by Terpenter, the musician who for the first time transformed the 4-string lyre into a 7-stringed lyre and created lyrical music along with Sappho and Arion and Alcaeus. They create lyrical music there. Terpenter carries the harp with him to Sparta, where the flute is added, and then we have Greek music up and running, Greek lyrical music, and then it becomes taken up into the Greek drama as the chorus. The chorus all sing their lines, and all of this becomes integrated into Greek drama, which, as Nietzsche describes in The Birth of Tragedy, then falls apart in the 4th century BC, and Plato becomes the last life raft upon which the Greek drama floats with his dialogues. And then, of course, in Plato's Republic, we have a retrieval with his myth of the cave, a retrieval of the Orpheus and Eurydice myth, when he imagines his ideal philosopher guiding from the cavern where the realm of the shadows, the phantom forms, exists, and he guides him up out of the light to behold the realm of the eternal forms. A sort of retrieval of that myth with a successful bringing out of the underworld muse into the light. Now, this is, of course, exactly what Brian Epstein did. Brian Epstein was the manager of the Beatles, often referred to as the 5th Beatle, but actually, as we'll see in a minute, there is a 5th Beatle, and it's their muse that becomes the essential sort of phantom member of the group, and which provides them with their greatness and as well as their trouble. But Brian Epstein had not the slightest interest in pop music, and so on his lunch hour one day he went over to this underground bar called the Cavern, where the Beatles in Liverpool were playing. They had just come back from Hamburg, where they got their famous mop-top haircuts. And he saw them, and he was so impressed with them that he decided at that point that he wanted to manage them. But he said he laid down a couple of conditions, one which was that they would all have to dress in mohair suits and ties, they would have to clean up their image, no more eating meals on stage or shouting back at the audience or bantering amongst themselves in between acts. Everything would have to be linearized and straightened up. And so we have then, largely under the supervision of Brian Epstein's genius, the creation of what I call the first Beatleverse, in which the first Beatles avatars are created as 4 clones of each other, and they look this way on their first 5 albums, which come out from 63 to 65. And the music on the first 5 albums all basically sounds the same stylistically. It all sounds like it's done by recognizably the same group. And the movies come out at this time too, films like A Hard Day's Night and Help, which accelerate the Beatles' avatars to light speed. They appear on the Ed Sullivan Show. And they're all identical, and they have, on the Ed Sullivan Show, they look like these 4 marionettes. They have this sort of jerky rhythm to them as they play, and they look like little puppets, little marionettes that are playing upon a stage, the stage that has been plugged in and had electric current sent through it. And in the movie, their avatars grow up to drive-in size proportions, as though one were shining a spotlight on them and projecting giant shadows on the wall of a building. It's an image that does occur in one of their movies, actually. And so there's a gigantification of the avatars that takes place at this point. And that is then the creation of the first Beatleverse with these avatars, where the music is all recognizably the same, and it all revolves around one theme. And that one theme is, of course, love, eros. Every one of the songs on these first 5 albums, Please Please Me, and With the Beatles, and Help, and Beatles for Sale, and Hard Day's Night, all of these songs revolve around love. And so it's like they're wandering troubadours at this time who always sang their songs to a lovely woman. In this case, it's the muse. But they have become like the Pandava brothers, and actually originally they started out as a 5-some. There was a 5th member initially, Stuart Sutcliffe, who gave them the name the Beatles. And they started that way, like the 5 Pandava brothers in the Mahabharata, the great Indian epic, in which they are all married to one woman named Draupadi. And they set down a stipulation that each of the different Pandava brothers, in order to avoid confusion or trouble, has to pass her off after 2 nights. So they each have her for 2 nights, and it goes around in that way, sharing her polyandrously. And we have in this myth, of course, the Hindus have preserved a very old practice that's native to India, polyandry. But that's it, and that's basically what the Beatles are doing at this point as a foursome. They're sharing their muse in common. And the muse is now beginning to inspire them with wonderful songs and beginning to give a certain success to them. We know that they're all talking about on these songs, it's basically their muse, because they never name her. If you'll notice, all these songs are about, and I love her, I want to hold your hand, she loves me. All these songs are a mysterious you or a she who is never named, except on one song named Anna. But that song was written by someone else. and she's never named, so it's always this mysterious she that they're addressing on these first 5 albums. So we know that they're talking about their muse, and their great creative relationship with their muse here is such that the muse is inspiring them with fresh lyrics, and so they become one of the first rock bands in history, along with perhaps the Beach Boys, to write their own lyrics for their own songs. And so this is an innovation, that the band actually becomes the source of their own lyrics. Sing Me Muse is the way all the classical epics begin, and this is the way the Beatles start out their career, with this very positive relationship to their muse on these first 5 albums. And so then with 1965 comes around, and with their album Rubber Soul, we get to the end of the first Beatle verse and the creation of the second Beatle verse. With Rubber Soul, we have a completely different set of Beatles and a completely different set of avatars. The cosmology is different, the drugs are different. In the earlier period, they had moved from alcohol. Now, with the second period, they moved to marijuana after meeting Bob Dylan. And with Bob Dylan, they begin to get a sense of the possibility of writing lyrics that matter, not just goofy song lyrics of love-inspired 20-year-olds, but writing songs that matter now, and that becomes important to them. And so the quality of the lyrics begin to improve dramatically. Lennon and McCartney co-writing these songs together begins to improve dramatically at this time. And Rubber Soul is the first album on which they begin to look different. If you look at the cover of the album, all 4 of them are shown looking down at the viewer for the first time since the first album, Please Please Me, which had shown all 4 of them looking down at the viewer from the top of a staircase. So it's as though they've gone back to the first album, retrieved it on the spiral, and they're inaugurating a new creative epoch here with Rubber Soul and Revolver. And they all are dressed differently, and they all look differently. They're beginning to separate and individuate, which is a good thing, of course, but it's also a bad thing, because now their relationship to the muse is no longer collective. It's on this album for the first time that Lennon and McCartney begin to decouple as songwriters, and they begin to compete. The first beginnings of their competition with each other as songwriters stems from this album, which is my favorite Beatles album, actually. I think it's a great creative work of art. Both Rubber Soul and Revolver, I think, are their 2 best albums. So this is a rock band that is creating some of the best rock music in the history of rock and roll, and they're at the height of their powers. It's also the first album on which they introduced for the first time into the history of rock and roll the sitar. So they're bringing in Hindu influences now on the song Norwegian Wood. But we'll note that we're beginning to get, especially on the song Norwegian Wood, we're beginning to get intuitions of the beginnings of the disintegration of their relationship with their muse. That song, we recall, Norwegian Wood, is about a man who follows a woman back to her apartment, and she denies him sex that night and makes him sleep in the bathtub. When she gets up and goes to work in the morning, he burns down her apartment. And so now we have the muse in a troubling relationship with Lennon here on this song. And with McCartney's song, I'm Looking Through You, he's beginning to say in this song that now his relationship with the muse is troubled. He can no longer hear her, he says on the song, the same way as he always could in the past. And now he's beginning to see through her. So trouble is beginning to destabilize their relationship to the muse now, partially because with the decoupling of them as songwriters and becoming individuals, they're each developing a private relationship with the muse, and they're beginning to abscond with her. Each one of them are trying to take over this collective muse and each one of them wants her for himself. And so, as with the Pandava brothers in the Mahabharata, the fivefold unity begins to split apart here as each one tries to run off with the female, the invisible fifth Beatles. But this is some of their best music, and so this is the second Beatle verse. And the new drug, of course, introduced is marijuana. The first drug in the first Beatle verse was alcohol. The second drug becomes marijuana. And then in the third Beatle verse, now the next drug will be LSD, which is now introduced starting with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Now, there had been a problem. In 1966, when the Beatles had been on tour for Revolver, they went on a world tour, and there were a couple of problems. There was a very strange episode that happened to them in Manila in the Philippines when they went to give two major concerts there. And Imelda Marcos demanded that they come to see her, but they snubbed the visit. They weren't much into that, courting royalty and so forth. And as a result of that, they were roughly treated by the Philippine army, who roughed them up at the airport, redirected their car on the strange routes, and basically harassed them in a very serious, scary way. Finally, they were let go. They were let go on the plane, and they were able to leave. But it began to really disturb them, and they started to realize that something strange was beginning to happen to them. There was another episode on stage in Mississippi when somebody threw firecrackers on the stage as the result of Lennon saying that they were bigger that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus Christ. The South didn't take kindly to that. Somebody threw firecrackers on the stage, and they thought somebody was trying to take a gunshot at them. And then, so in Candlestick Park in San Francisco, they gave their last concert.